The following presentation will be a close analysis of Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave by Kinan Moufti. The presentation poses the following question. What effect has the history of prejudice and discrimination toward African Americans, portrayed in the critically acclaimed film 12 Years a Slave, had on the internalized distrust that many African Americans possess toward white America? Throughout this presentation, I'll be examining some of the violent imagery that is used within the film, as well as some of the thematic strategies revolving around racism and slavery, as well as intense cinematic strategies in order to explain the distrust. And with that, I've arrived at the following thesis statement. The portrayal of violence using intense cinematic and thematic strategies like timing, silence, and despondency in the film 12 Years a Slave explains the lasting distrust that African Americans possess toward white Americans. What's seen in some of the images posed here is a scene from the film where a slave is being lynched by a white slave master, and to the right is an image of more recent police brutality, which I'll be touching on later in the presentation as some of the lasting effects of the brutality that is seen throughout the film. First, let us begin with a summary of the film 12 Years a Slave. The film is based on a true story where an African-American violinist named Solomon Northup is a free man living with his wife and children in Saratoga Springs, New York in the 1841. Solomon is invited on a prospective work trip where he was then drugged and kidnapped and sold as a slave in New Orleans. He was quickly given the name Platt by his new white slave master. He was then traded to the William Ford plantation where he spent little over a year and then was traded again to the Epps plantation. He was tortured continuously and treated as a slave and not as a free man. In his gruesome 12-year journey, which is explored in depth in the film and later on in this analysis, Solomon is faced with many obstacles. He finally meets an empathetic Canadian man who is willing to help. Through this journey, it is discovered that he was kidnapped, and help finally arrives, helping him return to New York to be with his family and become a free man again. Director Steve McQueen uses silence within scenes to capture the agonizing hopelessness that Solomon experiences. In several scenes, the director chooses to film close-up on Solomon's face in complete agony. These scenes lack any music or dialect, emphasizing the sense of hopelessness and distraught felt by a slave like Solomon. However, the most destructive and impactful element of this film, I feel, is the use of time in scenes itself. The director consciously manipulates the scene timing to carefully depict meaning behind violent scenes. This film is a brilliant example of how to use time to deliver meaning and emotion. 12 Years a Slave uses large slabs of uninterrupted violent scenes that seem to permeate the narrative of the film. The imagery displayed within the violent acts portrays the perspective of Solomon's experience. So rather than the traditional means of taking multiple shots, piecing them together like a traditional film would do, the audience is granted an uninterrupted and comprehensive feeling of the reality of Solomon's world, by being able to experience it all uninterrupted and unobtrusive real time. The cruelty felt in many scenes is also a result of the director's decision to never cut away. Some of these shots reach upwards of 5-6 minutes. Most sequences become so long that the audience is finally able to disengage from the real world and immerse themselves into Solomon's world. As a result, the audience's engagement with the sequence in the scenes enhance their emotions that they feel as bystanders, and this serves the function to give us an insight as audience members into how Solomon truly feels. The edits are limited so that the audience is never given a chance to look away. I believe the director wanted us to engage with this feeling of despondency and absolute agony that Solomon feels throughout the entire film. There is no end in sight for Solomon, and the cinematic decisions reflect that. The devastating nature of time in Solomon's world is emphasized through these decisions to minimize edits and cuts. In his world, time is never ending, and needless to say, it's never on his side. Only 8 minutes of the film are spent showing his freedom. I believe this is symbolic of the lasting effects of slavery and prejudice that it has had on him. The lynching scene is one in which I believe the director significantly exemplifies the power of how to manipulate time. For the first time, McQueen uses quick cutaways within a 2-minute span to portray how Solomon is beat up, captured, and is then hung on a noose. The first time where compressed timing is used, it's done so to portray that the chaotic events, as they were likely felt by Solomon himself, are shown to the audience. He does not want us, as the audience members, to have a clear visual image of what's happening leading up to the lynching, because that's how Solomon experienced it himself. The scene slows down as we are met with a 4-minute shot of Solomon hanging from a noose, trying to frantically set his feet, as seen on the picture on the very right. This shot is set in complete silence, and cutaways show that several white Americans in the area can see him but do not react at all. From the stripping of his identity to his eventual dehumanization, to him silently waiting for his torture to end, the use of time extinguishes all hope for both Solomon and the audience members combined. And on the contrary, any sense of freedom he experiences is immediately minimized through cuts, as explained leading up to the lynching scene. All this selective direction from Steve McQueen, I believe, is used to emphasize the powerful feelings of hopelessness and frustration that were built up within Solomon and other slaves alike. We will now be examining the thematic strategy applied by McQueen. Racism clearly reigns as the emphatic theme for this film. The film conveys how racism is the most extreme form of human hatred, showcasing its powerful, detrimental effect on African Americans. Slavery is also a prominent theme in this film, and it's intended to showcase the dehumanization of African American slaves by white American slave owners. As the two overarching themes of the film, 12 Years a Slave battles with the racism that fuels slavery, and specifically Solomon Northup's suffering and torment. The narrative illustrates how racism is more so an instrument for human evilness and is more man-made than it is inherent. This sort of artificial fabrication of racism provides a justification for slave owners to be cruel and inhumane and unrelenting. While the choice that slave owners and bystanders may have had was not apparent, it certainly did exist. And within these themes, it is revealed that heartbreaking realities of slavery. The film itself carries the assertion that racism is man-made and a means for human brutality. On the image to the left, I believe Solomon points out we can see Solomon among some of the other slaves. Now, it's important to note that it's noted throughout the film that Solomon highlights that racism does not seem to be more about skin color as much as it is about slave owners feeling justified to act in a cruel manner. Towards the end of the film, where Solomon meets the Canadian carpenter Bass, they make several references to slaves who look entirely white or slave owners whose skin is darker than their slaves. For instance, when Solomon is initially being sold into slavery, he notices that one of the most famous slave dealers, Gooden, has a darker complexion, similar to that of the slaves he was purchasing in auction. Later, while serving the vicious Edwin Epps of the Epps plantation, Solomon meets another slave who is whiter than the slave master he belonged to. The Canadian carpenter Bass also made some references about how racism was uncalled for and that humans of any race are more alike than they are different. Though the racist system appears to be absurd, it was the dominant worldview at this time, especially at the Southern society, and the evil it leads to is shown most clearly in the characters portrayed in this film. Some of the slave masters used their slaves as a means to satisfy their own craving for violence and sadistic entertainment. Through that analysis of some of the film's strategies using themes and cinematic decisions to evoke certain emotions within the audience and portray the feelings that many slaves went through and the brutality that they faced, I believe that there are severe lasting effects that still exist in today's communities. The interactions and relationships between black and white Americans throughout the film have lasting effects on both races. There are internalized distrust by African Americans towards whites, and in the same sense, there is internalized racism by white Americans towards African Americans. And through the intense interactions that occurred in the 19th and 20th century, these still exist in a significant way today, and we'll be exploring how they manifested in the next slides. The images you see in this slide are ones of police brutality as well as white supremacy. One of the interesting manifestations in which this distrust from African Americans towards white Americans occurs today is a result of police brutality. There have been an incredible amount of deaths of unarmed black American men at the hand of white law enforcement officials. Now, historically, the relationship between black Americans and the police has been far from ideal and has often been seen as a means of social control and protecting the interest of the wealthier demographics. Police misconduct increases in communities that are economically challenged and where residents are ethnic minorities such as African Americans or Latino. And this is still the strategy today, as the use of profiling by law enforcement officials that are of the white race against black Americans exists in a significant way, resulting in unsolicited firing of arms toward black Americans, as well as smaller incidents like unwarranted stops and stopping innocent black people for no clear reason. And this has resulted in a great mistrust of the police. A figure here shows that the number of unarmed men killed per 100,000 as in 2015, there's a significant advantage. There seems to be a much greater number of African Americans being unarmed and killed per 100,000 in the United States as compared to white Americans and Latinos as of 2015. What is more alarming, however, is that the injustice prevails. In the year that this graph was taken, only 10 of the policemen involved in the homicide of African American men were actually charged, and of those 10 officers, only 2 were convicted, and of those 2, only 1 officer received jail time. And so the favoritism that appears to be given towards white Americans in law enforcement over unarmed African American men who don't appear to be getting their justice increases the mistrust that exists between the two, and a lot of it is stemmed from the internalized racism that existed from the days of slavery as portrayed in the film. Another manifestation of the lasting effects of slavery that were portrayed in the film can be described as the distrust of African Americans toward the U.S. healthcare system. Now, the U.S. medical system has long discriminated against black Americans. As a matter of fact, research has shown that when black Americans carry identical diseases to similar white American counterparts, they are much more likely to die due to a lack of treatment. The U.S. medical establishment has a long history of discriminating and exploiting black Americans dating back to the days of slavery. In the 18th and 19th century, medical leaders used black bodies without consent for its own advancement, not to mention the use of technologies and institutionalized racism to reinforce the systems of oppression that were already prevalent. Blacks were also forced to participate in dissections and medical examinations. Oftentimes, dead black bodies were robbed from their graves and were used as a source of surgical and anatomical experimentation. Later during the Reconstruction era, white American doctors also argued that former slaves would not thrive in a free society because their minds were not used to coping psychologically with having freedom due to the continued years of oppression and torment that white Americans brought up onto them. Due to the aforementioned reasons, it is easy to understand why many African Americans today still continue to have this distrust toward the U.S. healthcare system, as it is a manifestation of the previous discrimination, prejudice, and even dating back to slavery. Finally, looking back at our research proposal question, we can see that the effect that this history of prejudice, discrimination, that was portrayed in the film through racism and slavery has created an internalized distrust that has manifested itself in many interesting ways in modern day America. Police brutality represents the mistrust of African Americans towards law officials, as well as the continued existence of racism amongst law officials. And the distrust of African Americans towards the U.S. healthcare system demonstrates the same two-way relationship where oppression continued to exist within medical institutions and black Americans were again taken advantage of and used in unethical ways. We can now understand how the dehumanizing behaviors that were portrayed in 12 Years a Slave have affected numerous African American generations moving forward, and that the clever manipulation of timing and sound throughout the film done by Steve McQueen provides a ground for understanding the foundation of the distrust that exists among two races in America. Thank you for listening.